Okay.
Hello, Pablo.
Hi, Barry. How are you? Thanks for sharing. Thanks for joining us. Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Well,
Hi there.
the host is Nicolas. He will start. So, Nicolas, the floor is yours. You're muted, Nicolas. Good start.
Those are Pablo's jokes. He usually mute me when I am starting to talk. That's something that you will see along other series of the IDC. So I want to welcome everybody. Today we have a very interesting theme, the presentation of the work of Professor Marsden and Professor Podszun about restoring balance to digital competition, sensible rules, effective enforcement. The idea today is to have a presentation by Professor Marsden and then the comments by Professor Vezzoso. But first of all, I want to give Pablo the microphone to explain about the IDC, and he wants to share some images with us today. So Pablo, go ahead.
Thank you, Nicolas. For all those who it's the first time here, the IDC is just a place in which we want to promote discussions, independent discussion, and I stress the independency of the institute. Obviously, on competition law and policy issues or related issues. We don't have a venue. We don't have any physical venue. The idea is before the pandemic, the idea was to have a place that would be more virtual in order to be able to discuss more with other jurisdictions. And I think the COVID pandemic has also helped us on this regard. We do have a sort of an international advisory board in which we are very happy here to see some of them: Simon Holmes, Larry Sorokin, Barry Hawk, Ian Forrester gave he cannot make it because he's chairing another event today. Richard Wish, I don't see him, but he will be between us again. So that advisory board in a certain way helps us to sort of equalize our opinions and what we do. So we are very thankful to have them on board and to be very active on our activities. We do also have some chairs around the region. As you know, the IDC, was started in Buenos Aires in Argentina, but we do have some chapters also in Chile, in Colombia, in Mexico. Now we're starting a new activity in Peru. So the idea is to be a place for everybody. All the voices are here. We want all the voices to be heard. If there are some dissents, again, that's also welcome, with respect, obviously. So I think our idea, again, is to disseminate ideas and discuss and try to contribute to the independently, obviously, to the discussion on competition policy issues. As Nicolas said, I do have some images, but honestly, they're just images. I won't say anything, actually. I'm going for once. There it is. This might all of us, all those who have practiced competition law, might know what it is. The year 1890 is it's not a coincidence. The year of the Sherman Act, the Standard Oil, the Octopus. 1904, break up the Standard Oil, the one of the first cases in the US. Then just on the last century, 1970 something, welcome to the digital age. We see there on the top right, one of the cases, the first case on the digital world, IBM against the US, the government, 1975. Then we see this was the boss in the world. Actually the CEO of Microsoft, Bill Gates, one of the person of the year, 1984. Then we see, again, 1997, an investigation started by the US authorities. 1999, this was the cover of Time magazine, and we chose the Time magazine mainly this because there's lots of images on these people like Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, etc. As we saw, obviously, after the case in the US, we also have that famous case in Europe on the Microsoft case or the Microsoft saga. The world just some years nearer us, in 2017, we have all maybe saw this cover at The Economist, the new oil data. The person of the year, that was not that long ago, only 2010. And now, if we see the cover of the same magazine, Time, last year, these are the comments on Facebook. We've seen the discussions in the judiciary. Now we have, as we think, maybe as we speak, we might have a decision on the Facebook case by the FTC in the US. The OECD and many other organizations had also raised the challenges we are living on this digital platforms world. This is a credit to Juan David Gutierrez, also one of the members of the IDC, but it's mainly, the source is mainly the OECD documents. And then one of our speakers today, Simonetta Vezzoso, she is taking the work of including all the reports that are being published by authorities or institutions. Here on the left, I don't know if you see my pointer, but I mean, there we have what we're going to discuss today, restoring balance on digital competition. Just near that, there's another one of the UK, unlocking digital competition, or the Pullman report. Up there, we see the George Mason of the Global Antitrust Institute, I think is the last one, published actually last Thursday. So with no further ado, the idea is today to discuss and to comment with one of its authors, Philip Marsden, the report that they published like some weeks ago. So Nicolas, that's all I have to say on my images.
Thank you, Pablo. So basically this work is a very interesting one. To do nothing is not an option, and maybe ex post enforcement is not sufficient. So here we have some proposals regarding antitrust enforcement, competition law enforcement, and other privacy and consumer protection issues based on three principles, basically freedom of competition, fairness of intermediation, and sovereignty of decision-making. So with no further ado, I will leave you with Professor Philip Marsden, who is a professor of law and economics at the College of Europe in Bruges, deputy chair of the Bank of England Enforcement Decision-Making Committee, and a case decision maker for several UK regulators. He was a member of Her Majesty Treasury's Digital Competition Expert Panel, which produced the report Unlocking Digital Competition. So, Professor Marsden, please go ahead. Thank you very much for joining us today.
That's great. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to see so many familiar faces, make some new friends. I've put the report in the chat, and if you have had enough of listening to me in a few minutes, I've put some music in as well. As you mentioned, I was a member of the Furman panel in the UK, and so I won't rehash all of that, but one of my frustrations at the time in writing that report is we had quite a nice chapter, we thought, about how our proposals would be enforced. And we intentionally decided not to publish that chapter because at the time we were just trying to land the argument to move from ex post antitrust enforcement to adding on a complementary regime of some relatively targeted rules to be enforced by a digital markets unit. The rules and the code of conduct would apply to firms which we called had a strategic market status. And so for about a year after that, I engaged in some antitrust tourism. I came to visit many of you before lockdown. The rest of the members of the panel all had young children: Jason Furman, Diane Coyle, Derek McCauley, Amelia Fletcher. My kids have grown up and gone away and come back again, and so I was more free to travel around. I was kindly invited to places, and everywhere I went, amazingly, except some parts of the US, we received some praise for the report and interest in this idea. And you see some of our ideas being taken up by some governments. The CMA, for example, accepted almost all of our proposals except two. And then in the last week and a half or so, the CMA has accepted our proposals on merger control. The FTC has accepted our proposals on merger control tests changing, and so it's very heartening as an academic to engage in a debate and see that some of the developments move along. But we were criticized by some people, most notably Bill Kovacic and others, for not mentioning where these rules should be enforced. And we didn't mention the where, because then the headline at the time, if there was any at all, would be, Furman report says CMA needs new rules, or Ofcom needs new rules, or new regulator needs new rules, whatever. And everything would become about like, well, is that regulator going to get captured? Is that regulator appropriate? What's the budget? Blah, blah, blah. Who's the CEO? All this stuff, none of which we were interested in. We wanted to just land the main message, which I think we did. And Simonetta's fantastic slide of all these extra reports have landed that message of moving to some form of ex-ante regulation. There are some critics still out there, of course, who still say this is mad socialism. Crazy, can't possibly be enforced, let alone by a small island off the French coast, such as the UK. So we started thinking also about, well, where would it be enforced? And this is what Rupprecht, Podszun, and I wrote about last month. We wrote the report that you have in the chat now under the auspices of the German presidency of the European Union. As you'll know, the Digital Markets Act will be proposed on December 9th. It will have two pillars, which is a new competition tool, which is essentially a copy of the British market investigations regime. And it will have ex-ante rules, a blacklist, a grey list, a white list, do's and don'ts. And this is what we wanted to explore in our report. So we're writing it in the context of the German presidency, but knowing full well that, after a few months, the Portuguese take over. And then when the Digital Markets Act actually gets passed, it will be the French who will be responsible. And we wanted to contribute to that sort of European discussion, but also, an international discussion. So to get to what we actually said in our report, Rupprecht and I were saying, well, look, the European Commission in particular, and we target our report at the European Commission, but we hope it would have some broader relevance in many of your jurisdictions, to the extent that you might be thinking about moving in some way to a complementary ex-ante regime, and maybe changing some aspects of antitrust and merger control. But so I will be using a lot of Euro wording, but we hope it might have some resonance in other countries. So clearly the European Commission is stepping up its efforts to come up with these new regulations. They've leaked, and probably almost all of you have a copy of the leak, of the blacklist and the do's and don'ts and the structure that's been set up. And this is a new regulatory regime for digital gatekeepers. EVP Margrethe Vestager has proposed a new competition tool and some form of ex-ante regulation for platforms. And what Rupprecht and I were trying to do is say, well, look, when you're thinking about the rules, we know that for the next year or two, the Parliament is going to debate everything, every adjective, every semicolon. What is self-preferencing? What is unfair self-preferencing? Should it be anti-competitive self-preferencing? Should it be distorting self-preferencing? What bodies should be subject to these rules? Are they bodies with strategic market status? Should they be systemic? Is the current wording? What is a gatekeeper? All of this will be debated, and it rightly should be. But we also thought, well, look, when you look back at the Sherman Act and the Canadian Competition Act and the European Treaties of Rome, they're not very detailed at all. The detail comes in the case law, it comes in the regulatory guidance, it comes in practice. And we thought maybe it's perhaps more helpful to set out some rules, which we humbly call sensible rules in our report. But really we focus in the majority of our report on how is this going to be enforced, and what kind of collaboration amongst the various entities, in particular at the European level, would be needed. And so we were asking, look, our previous reports, Furman, Stigler, the rest, the CMA digital advertising study with fantastic annexes about the code of conduct and what is a company with strategic market status. These have all set out the why, and we wanted to move on to the how. So how do we design these new tools and regulation to correct market failures in relation to digital platforms before the abuses of market power happen? Appreciate that's a big existential leap for many people, because they'll say, wait a minute, we shouldn't do anything until there's been an infringement. But we're saying clearly the political movement is to try to do something prophylactic, something preventative in some ways. How do we reset the balance so that genuine innovation and choice prevail, and that all businesses still have an equal opportunity to compete in the marketplace? And how do we ensure that the best product wins, not just the platform that offers it, no matter how good that platform may be? So as Nicholas mentioned, we had three principles that guide our rules: freedom of competition, fairness of intermediation, and the sovereignty of economic actors to take their decisions autonomously, and that includes you as users. These principles were, described by us intentionally as having, in the European context, a constitutional character. In many ways, we think of the work of many scholars, Simon Holmes and others, that remind us that the treaty and certain principles in the treaty have a constitutional nature. It is not just some sort of dry area of economic law we're talking about. It is that, but it's not just that. There's some deeper aspects here within competition law. And that should be the foundation of the inevitable European regulation here. There will be a European regulation. And so let's focus all of the intelligence in this area, to the extent that anybody cares, on the how, not fighting on about, is this socialism or not. It's going to happen. So let's make sure that it's done well. So those are our principles. But for the most part, we've talked about enforcement, but I'll say a few things about the rules. I mean, our rules, our do's and don'ts, they set out primarily obligations or dues on platforms, and then we have some don'ts. So even though the current leaked document by the Commission, and I'm sure the inevitable document will be mainly on don'ts, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, we actually thought it might be more interesting to talk about some do's, things that they should do as positive obligations as gatekeepers. And then with respect to that, they're related to platform openness, obligations of neutrality, obligations of interoperability with some limiting principles, obligations relating to non-discrimination, fair terms, the ability to control algorithmic decisions, access to justice, motherhood, apple pie, all these sorts of things. But we also had some don'ts as well, which is relating primarily to certain degrees of denial of the ability to multi-home, denial of a fair opportunity to appear on a screen due to some form of self-preferencing. And we did agonize a little bit about the wording in our document about self-preferencing, so I welcome you to look at that. And we had some defenses that we put in there. But those are the rules, and there'll be many options and academic debate and parliamentary debate about the rules themselves. But as I say, the main point I want to focus on today and in this report is the enforcement. So we felt, what institutional design do we need? How do we enforce these rules? To us, that's the core of the whole debate, because it also affects what rules you choose. Can you get away with general do's and don'ts, or do you have to be really specific, really specific? And how specific can you be when the platforms have many different business models, communications, commerce platforms? Some are aggregators, some are true platforms, some aren't platforms at all. Some are platforms you wouldn't be that concerned about, you don't think, but maybe you should be, and these kinds of principles that we discussed try to differentiate amongst some of those. But mainly we felt that the Commission's proposal to have a new market investigations regime would help us identify some of the problems that are coming up, and also help apply these rules. So we foresee that obviously the Commission will be able to trigger market investigations. We support this new competition tool. I do still think that the political will is strong enough for Margrethe Vestager to get this new competition tool. They weren't that interested in it 15 years ago. They're very interested in it now. If they don't get it, then they'll end up with the ex-ante regulation, and I think that would be a shame. I feel they need the regulation, and they need the ability to conduct evidential and strong evidential inquiries as well, rather than just moving to a pure regulatory regime. So we recognize that those kinds of market investigations, I feel from my experience at the CMA, do really need to have strict timelines, very transparent and open processes, strong order-making powers, and obviously appeal rights. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but I was honored to be part of the retail banking inquiry in the UK that came up with the open banking orders, which when the UK does market investigations, it ends up creating for the sector it's looking at ex-ante regulation. All right, there's no question. This is not antitrust enforcement. And so if you're looking at ex-ante regulation in our banking inquiry, we mandated open APIs, data portability, and a range of other measures, including digital sandboxes. And we had remedies that we hoped would go with the grain of technological developments, not just do what the politicians really exerted a lot of pressure on the inquiry team to do, and we ignored this pressure, but was to break up the banks. And you see in many countries, this political pressure to break up the platforms, And in our Furman report and in the report Rupprecht and I did, we don't really talk about breakups that much. We don't think that that's necessarily helpful in this area, but we think that some behavioral changes, these rules would be quite helpful. We propose that the Commission would create a new, what we call an early alert unit. It could be something else, but it would be formed within the Competition Authority, DG Comp, to monitor market developments, particularly movements to what we call unnatural tipping. Okay, and we can talk about that if you like, a bit about what's natural and what's not. But the Commissioner does have a big concern right now about unnatural tipping. I think she might have a concern about tipping generally. I think that would be misguided, because tipping is a function of certain markets with network effects. But we felt that if there was a degree of unnatural tipping, for example, the platform has gained an advantage by breaking some of the ex-ante rules and preventing multi-homing and preventing accesses to data and doing bizarre self-preferencing in an anti-competitive way, then therefore that would be something that we would be concerned about. And that unit, the early alert unit, would report, particularly to Comp, about when this market investigation tool should be deployed, but also it would have a strong liaison function with DG Connect, who is the regulator responsible for the new rules. And they would be the ones who we foresee having a platform compliance unit within DG Connect, which would be formed to ensure that the new rules remain fit for purpose, given such market developments. Whatever the European Parliament comes up with in terms of the wording of the rules, they have to be applied. And we feel that compliance unit would be responsible for that. It would be responsible for interpreting the rules, the scope of the application, and the two units, the early alert unit and the platform compliance unit, Comp and Connect, would work together closely to ensure the effective application of the new rules, including issuing guidance and other things. We also, and I'll mention this in a bit, we also propose a platform complaints panel that would deal swiftly and independently with private complaints of violations of the rules, especially including access to data. And I think almost every report I've read, except for one by George Mason, has proposed some form of private adjudicative mechanism to ensure that the rules have some teeth. So we recognize that in this sector, effective enforcement has to keep pace with market dynamics. It requires sensible and flexible rules. And our study, our report, was written, being well aware of the movement to enact a Digital Markets Act and to create a new competition tool. And we planted our suggestions, recognizing also the institutional structures in Europe, which are very siloed, and we want to argue for much more collaboration between DG Comp and DG Connect, and also with the national authorities through the European Competition Network, to ensure that these regulations are applied in an evidence-based way. And so hopefully some of those points are really just motherhood and apple pie issues, and I'm not saying they're easy, but they're things that I think any jurisdiction, regional grouping, would be interested in hopefully applying to ensure that these are not rules that are frozen in aspic, that don't apply as markets evolve, that become out of date, or indeed that in some way chill innovation. So I'll close with just a sort of a case study, sort of an interplay. What we would see is that the early alert unit would identify the cause of tipping markets and identify if that was natural through superior skill, foresight, and industry, or whether there was a predominance of these prohibitions. And a lot of players made lately of various Google cases around the world that they relied quite heavily on a degree of exclusivity and payments for data. Anybody who knows anything about vertical agreements knows that these are not per se illegal in most countries. But the predominance or the preponderance of the exclusivity is actually a concern under European law in many sectors. The degree to which it contributes to a substantial foreclosure and then an SLC, a substantial lessening of competition. So that is an aspect where we would argue that it be looked at, and the pro-competitive and anti-competitive aspects of those exclusivity provisions, be assessed to see the degree to which they contribute to that kind of tipping. And then we see whether a market investigation is warranted. We'd have a timeline, ideally, 18 months or 24 months to like the UK schedule. That people will say, well, that's so long. When you compare it to antitrust, that is not a long period of time. Okay, that is very, very quick. to do something like this. And it would be an open, transparent process with multi-party hearings. I'm a big fan of multi-party hearings. European Commission isn't right now. I hope they move towards multi-party. In the banking inquiry, we found that it was much better to have all the banks and the challenger banks in the room when we were discussing the remedies that were needed, because then, you know, there was a lot less posturing and frankly, you know, just rubbish being thrown at the panel. We could actually discuss, you know, what remedies were possible that the incumbents could offer and what remedies would help the entrants. So the role of this early alert unit we propose, you know, is like an investigatory arm of DG Connect's platform compliance unit. So it's based in comp, but it's an evidence-based unit that is actually assessing whether, hey, have markets tipped to a certain degree because of violations of the rules? What should we do about that? And so what we would say is the early alert unit recommends a market investigation, but it also says, well, wait a minute, if we think that some of the behavior violated the digital regulations, you know, and that's contributing to the platform's growth, and then a potential unnatural tipping of the market, then the solution is actually not to have a 2-year market investigation, but the tool instead it's to engage the platform compliance unit right away, you know, with assessing what, you know, what are these violations. If there's a violation of a blacklist rule, then something has to be done right away. And so that means that you might avoid the rationale in some cases for a market investigation, and it's you know, albeit a 2-year delay, but you still might be able to have some worthwhile remedies in a prophylactic way. The operating principle of our report is to remedy problems as expeditiously as possible through mandating compliance with the rules, and to enable those quick measures. You know, an appeal, you know, is against such a compliance order, you know, we would say should not have a suspensive effect, you know, unless a court decides that it should have suspensive effect. And so it's, you know, the predominant should be, no, actually, no, we're going to begin some sort of interim action here, and the usual rules of appellate review would apply. But we feel there's enough political will here to not allow sort of 9 years, 12 years of appeals before you have some suspensive effects. And frankly, when you look at some of the innovations and some of the exclusivities, some of the payments, some of the other odd conduct that we're looking at in the platform market on the margin, you know, I think, you know, there's clear justification that you can ask for a brief pause of some of this conduct while you assess whether it's violating the rules or not, rather than just letting it run on until it extinguishes all competition. I appreciate people might freak out at that, but I think in some cases it's clearly been proved that a short delay, a short pause of some of this conduct is not necessarily going to make the sky fall in. So the early alert unit, I'll close with this, you know, can propose new rules for the platform compliance unit to then engage with and put guidance out about. But you know, it would cooperate with national competition agencies. Ideally, you would have, you know, retired judges and others on the panel, national experts on the panel to do market investigations. But the actual monitoring of the rules themselves would be done by this platform compliance unit in a kind of a supervisory function. You know, and as Nicholas mentioned, you know, I sit on, you know, energy regulator competition cases, financial conduct authority competition cases, payment systems regulated cases. I'm deputy chair at the Bank of England. We do cases all the time. We have a supervisory function, an enforcement function, and an adjudicative function. The world doesn't fall in, and the markets that I am honored to look at in my current incarnation are pretty sensitive markets, and the world hasn't fallen apart because we have these supervisory and enforcement and adjudication functions, and I think they'd apply reasonably well to the tech platform market. So my final word is about the platform complaints panel. We suggest introducing a panel that works like an arbitration mechanism or an ombudsman, you know, for users of platforms. And so it would draw on independent adjudicators, ideally with experience in the sectors affected. It would offer a rapid remedy for clear violations that have been proven. We'd ask for a quick remedy for those who want to stop certain practices by the platform operator at a fast pace. But we would not leave this aspect of it to the public judiciary, with all respect to the judges on the call, and we would not leave it to the platform compliance unit. We would have an actual, you know, an enforcement unit that moves on from the supervisory of the compliance case. You see this in many sectors, so this is nothing really that earth-shaking. We would recommend that this panel that is assigned to each case is independent, and we would recommend that certain platforms of a particular status are subjected to submitting to this panel, and that standing panel of independent adjudicators will be supported by staff from DG Connect and perhaps Comp, but it will have clear powers to make remedial orders, and we recommend, we'll see what you think as I finish, we recommend relying on a paper-based adjudication mechanism with strict timelines, with the only operating principle being to identify whether the platform is in violation of the rules. We identify any objective justifications, defenses, and then we order corrective measures if necessary to restore competition. We're not really proposing fines as the primary remedy. We're proposing behavioral changes, orders to allow data to be accessed, banning certain forms of exclusivity, these sorts of things. There'd be time-limited remedies, but we would propose fines for violations of our orders, okay? And then we would allow, obviously, full merits appeal, but we would have a strong recommendation that this be necessarily swift, and in the original tradition of the Competition Appeals Tribunal in the UK, which was, to have quite a swift appeal mechanism. And so otherwise, we're just creating something that duplicates the existing system, which doesn't work at all. And we can talk, if you like, about how ineffective I feel some of the digital remedies have been and how delayed they've been. So that's the proposal in a nutshell. It's essentially proposing an effective enforcement mechanism. One of the reasons we inserted it into the debate at this stage is we wanted to make sure that the bureaucrats who are busy drafting the rules right now have that in mind. That this has to be enforced. This isn't something that you just deliver a draft legislation on December 9th and then you kick back. You've got to think about how is this going to be enforced. And so, we're not necessarily suggesting that ours is the best suggestion or anything. But we want it to be part of the debate. They're just ideas. They're not a final conclusion. It's what we discussed, a lot over the summer, Rupprecht and I, over Zoom. But we wanted to use it so that the debate would start focusing on this, rather than just the what we think is interesting, but not the crux of it, which is, what adjective should go in front of the word self-preferencing. Should it be unfair, distortive, or anti-competitive? That is not that interesting for us. It's how is that interpreted? How do we work out when in a particular case something has violated the rules, and then we build the guidance. So I welcome comments. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Simonetta and others have to say. We're just trying to contribute to the debate. During the course of our report, we were very grateful for critiques we had from various European institutional readers, and we're pleased that it's out there, and hopefully will be discussed, and at the very least, not ignored. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip. It's very interesting, this kind of real-time enforcement or study as things are happening. Now I want to give the microphone to Professor Simonetta Vezzoso. She's a professor of competition policy and intellectual property and a senior researcher of Università di Trento. Simonetta, please go ahead. Thank you very much for joining us today.
So thank you so much, Nicholas. Thank you so much, Pablo, and the Istituto de Derecho de la Competencia for this much unexpected and digital soul-steering invitation, I would say, and the opportunity to provide some comments on Philip's and Rupprecht's precious and hopefully auspicious report. Well, as Pablo has already shown us, the last 2 years have has witnessed the flourishing of a new literary genre in our field, that is, and especially under wind. But of course, good competition policy solutions in the digital age are very difficult to find, as the sheer number of reports shows us. So my question here, and what I've been thinking about, is how does this report, so the Marsden Podszun report, stand out from these highly qualified competitors, you might ask, and I have been asking myself. So the author themselves, and actually Philip just recalled it now, say, quote, "The ideas sketched in this paper are just that, ideas. They do not represent a final conclusion, but are an invitation to discuss." Okay, unquote, let's do it. In a nutshell, If you ask me, no good, bad, and ugly in this report, not the three categories that apply, but terrific, fascinating, and well, the interesting. Okay, and that is really the UK way of putting it. So let's start from the terrific. So terrific one, of course, the clear, loud message that relying on ex post law enforcement is insufficient. We urgently need new rules, new institutional capabilities to guarantee effective enforcement. Okay, that's wonderful. The platform economy needs new, but still sensible, and then we will get back to that, and more effective enforcement, unquote, great. So that was terrific number one. Second, that would be that this report has, actually, Philip just reminded it, restored my faith in a much needed, less technocratic and more principle-based pro-competition policy for the digital age. That is something that we lost the last 20 years. And then the authors consider that, quote, the new rules should be based on three principles, Philip just reminded them: freedom of competition, fairness of intermediation, and sovereignty of economic actors. They do not simply select them for their relevance, but describe them, as reminded right now, in constitutional language, because they believe they are really fundamentally important, and they should not just be a part of fair trading or consumer protection rules. They should be enshrined in what they propose, so the EU platform framework. Great, that was terrific number two. So the third terrific for me is that it relates to the second one, is zooming in on the sovereignty of economic actors to take their decisions autonomously. This is a truly terrific aspect of the report. It aims to ensure that consumers are not digital serfs, okay? They are not just inputs into tech giants' offerings, but instead are the king and queens of the competitive marketplace. And that's something that we need to repeat and repeat and repeat, especially in the digital age. So users merit a particular respect as human beings, not simply a datafied object that can be easily exploited. And that includes an interesting aspect of rules that should respect privacy, perhaps even beyond the GDPR to some extent. And I find it really quite interesting. It has to do, of course, with what the German Federal Court of Justice just reminded us, the need of informational self-determinations, how it plays out. That's really wonderful. So consumers should be given a choice. An example of no choice, Philip just referred to introduction of payment service, okay? Take it or leave it. And then it's choice, this one. So we should really think about choice, what it means, and then keep it simple. I think this is a very important message here, again, from the Facebook case to some extent, the decision of the Supreme Court, German Supreme Federal Court of Justice. Again, don't put services on top of it, and then the consumers have to take all of it. They should be really, I mean, what about choice in the digital age? So that was terrific number three. Terrific number four, leave policy choices to politicians, okay, or to people we have elected, okay? So that is the level of, definitely, when we think of participative antitrust, we should get to the point, perhaps, of enforcement, something that Philip just referred to with the banking sector. So involve them in the enforcement part of it. But what about rules? Rules should be set by politicians, by our legislator. They should not be decided by platforms, okay? And then in the way you enforce them, yes, okay, they should play a role. But as they say, they should not be a tea party discussion to delay real implementation. I think that's very important. And then let's move to the fascinating, okay? So the fascinating of this report. So the first one is quite admirable, that the authors do not fear getting their hands dirty in thinking about the details, okay? Aiming at a pragmatic and implementable framework for use of the new competition tool by the Directorate, the DigiConnect, and then also, of course, the new competition tool, how it works, and Philip has reminded us now of the details. Of course, I love the idea of the new early alerts unit to monitor market developments. Okay, we go back to that a little bit later, and that's absolutely necessary in this framework. And then something that I like related to that, that also they stress the institutional framework should be such that they can so that it's not out of touch with the essential aims of this commission, that we're building the digital single market and unleashing the power of digital innovation. It's a broad framework that we should consider. And there is quite a lot about the relationship between the different directorates. So I understand it's important to deal with it, because I think they are quarreling quite a lot at the moment. That is my impression, or perhaps they are not coming to a solution. There is something which I miss a little bit there. I know it's a complicated structure, but somehow I would have quite liked to see there some words of possible involvement also by other institutions at the EU level. And of course, I'm thinking of the European Data Protection Board, perhaps even Consumer Protection Cooperation Network somehow involved. So less a question of clusters and perhaps more a question of networks, even at the European level. I know it's perhaps a science fiction, but I think it's very important to discuss it. So that would be fascinating one. Fascinating two, I think there is the need to think of a stronger involvement of national authorities. I'm not saying which one. I'm not saying competition authority or regulator, telecom, I don't say, but definitely not only at the level of enforcement, as in the report is suggested, but also definitely at least at the level of monitoring, okay? So a big alerts unit, decentralized. I think this is really key. There are already some models there. Then, fascinating three, the fact that they really stress that they should be new rules. Okay, so the relevant. So how is self-preference? Is this the same as in the shopping case, or should we perhaps think of a more promising concept which looks into the future? So it's not. You should not just be stuck to what we have seen so far, because after a while, I mean, it's already outdated. It's quite clear, because those are clever guys. They think of new strategies and things every new day. So definitely, okay, reference, but look beyond that. Okay, it's not just the case law that should influence us. I think this is very important, because otherwise they say they would petrify in a short period what we have. Okay, so another important, so there will be fascinating four, that they stress the importance of leveling the regulatory playing field. And this is something that I would have liked to see a little bit more, perhaps explained, in the sense that there is a huge problem there of asymmetric power between the tech giants on the one hand and the government and the politicians and the forces on the other. So somehow, perhaps we have to think creatively also there, providing new flows of data. I don't know, but somehow we should think. I'm not sure that the sandboxing is a good idea in every possible source, but we should think of different tools, but be a little bit more creative in the sense, because there is a huge power asymmetry issue there. So, and then I have a final remark, and that would be on the interesting, okay, the interesting. Well, my question is, even though I recognize it's totally progressively wonderful, the best we can read about the how, I'm asking myself whether it goes far enough. Okay, I really have this question mark. I have no comment, just a big question here. As the poet would say, we should screw our courage to the sticking place and perhaps be a little bit more creative, perhaps take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them, okay? We should go that direction perhaps. So there is the need to tackle structural power imbalances with urgency. So I don't know, perhaps we need a little bit more regulation there. Perhaps we need a little bit more monitoring. Perhaps we need somebody dealing, each platform should have its own regulator. So we have really some clear issues. We have those GAFA, okay? And then perhaps we need a little bit more. So perhaps we need, because we haven't touched upon it, but what the authors are suggesting is actually a sort of symmetric regulation with some parts more for the rest. I totally agree we need platform regulation in some form. What we have in the platform to business regulation is not enough. It's transparency, but it's not enough, definitely. But I think that apart from that, we need, yes, ex-ante asymmetry information. Go for it. Tailor remedies towards specific structural digital platforms. I don't know. So somehow I'm not sure. So it's open for discussion here. And the thing is, we really need somebody looking at them day by day. So we need really a day-by-day interactions with them. So they need to have a big toolkit, possible things to do, but we need real-time regulation. We need to do perhaps even something proposed already, regulation by data. So perhaps the regulator getting so much data and then taking out the information and making the information available to everybody else. So being creative also in that respect. So that would be my, I think, yes, no. My very last point is that, of course, we need to be realistic. It's very important that the European Commission and the different authorities, national authorities, sort of show a united front, because lobbyists are going to exploit all possible cracks they see. So that's a very important point. So that's somehow, I don't know how the miracle is going to happen, but somehow, yes, it should be presented as a united front when we have the proposal, or working on the proposal. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Simonetta. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your comments. Very valuable indeed. We have some questions from the audience. The first one would be Simon Holmes. But first, before we go to the judge, Philip, do you have any reaction? And while we continue the discussion, might not be easy for you, but I mean, if you can actually also think about Latin American authorities on the comments, whatever you know from the region, because obviously the discussions might be the same, but they are definitely different on these latitudes. We do also have the GAFAMs, and might be other players, but I mean, again, Philip, if you have any reaction, and if any of you could definitely include Latin America in your thoughts, that would also be very valuable for us. Philip?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much, Simonetta, for the comments. I'll just be very brief. I've enjoyed all my travels through Latin America and talking to the various competition authorities and judges, and indeed, you're struggling with many of the same problems that the other countries are. Many of the points that come up occasionally, though, I hear are I heard in particular sometimes is, well, we know what we're doing. Antitrust is good enough. CADE in Brazil had Google cases, but and we can handle this, and this kind of thing, and that's fine. But even though I started out as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice in Canada, and so it took me a long time to decide that actually the Furman proposals that we made might be needed, because I really felt that if we could just speed up prosecutions in any jurisdiction, then that would be enough, that and that as long as we were looking at potential competition, dynamic theories of harm, and our investigations were comprehensive enough, that would be enough. And so to look at it in a sort of a Latin American context or other contexts, I just sense a degree to which some countries are just not there yet in terms of recognizing that the nature of these markets, like some other sectors, is such that sometimes the problem isn't really an antitrust problem. The problem is a kind of a structural problem through the network effects, and the inevitable winner takes it all nature of these markets means that there is an imbalance of power. So what you see in some jurisdictions is, instead of dialing up antitrust, they're dialing up unavoidable trading partner provisions, consumer protection provisions relating to economic dependency, terms and conditions, those kinds of things, which can work as well. And in a sense, and I'll close with this, the conduct that we're looking at in our proposals in Furman or in this report, a lot of them are kind of fair trading type principles. It's just that we feel that the enforcement model is not best left with the existing ex post regime, and that we have to have some rules that change the nature of the game in the first place, and that when we move to ex post review of the rules, though, and the adjudicative mechanism and appeals, we're nevertheless having a focus on due process, definitely, but also a concept that that justice delayed is justice denied, and when you're looking at a regime of a clear blacklist, clear offense, and that's all you're looking at is that conduct an offense? Yes, then you might not necessarily need 12 years of appeals to work that out. in a full merits appeal review to provide that due process and fairness. So you could have quicker appeals. But open to questions, all welcome to everything.
Thank you, Philip. Talking about and following your comments on appeals, Simon Holmes, the judge from the Competition Appeals Tribunal in the UK, has actually a specific question on that. Simon?
Hi, thanks, Philip. Great overview. Yes, indeed, my question is on the judicial side. I felt almost obliged to ask a question in this area, wearing my cat hat. You said that you would envisage a full merits appeal from the Platform Complaints Committee, but you'd like it to be quick, as was envisaged for the Competition Appeal Tribunal in the UK, reflecting, of course, the need for speed in tech. And as you said, justice delayed is justice denied. But I just wonder how realistic that is in an EU context. I would have assumed the appeal would have gone to the General Court, where there are huge delays. Is it correct that you'd see it going to the General Court or to somewhere else, or would you need perhaps to envisage a special chamber there or special rules? And of course, that's been proposed for years in the context of competition and antitrust without any success. So why should it be any more successful here than it was for competition law?
Yeah, no, excellent point, Simon. Yeah, so with respect to there's two parts to the appeal in our report. The decision to launch a market investigation and the decision on what is the result of the market investigation, we propose to have a JR standard, a judicial review standard, as in the UK. And even though, and that's primarily because it's a full and open inquiry in the UK, time-based, independent panel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and finding of infringement of the law. And so we feel that JR is enough. And that even though a breakup order or something else, some sort of internal divestiture order on a platform might seem to be a really strong remedy, it nevertheless doesn't require substantive full merits appeal. And so that's that part of it. The part you're talking about, you're absolutely right. We have decided, yes, we'll come down on the side of having substantive full merits appeals, despite the problems you're alleging. And I agree with them. The European system is, as we've heard lately from the latest UK judge to leave the European Court, is mired in delays, even though COVID has reduced its workload a bit. I would love there to be some sort of chamber, if there could be, for handling the appeals from these kind of code violations. These are not violations of competition law that we're talking about. It's a new code, new rules, blacklist, no economic evidence to be submitted, and people might rail against this and say, oh, you're introducing per se rules and object rules, and therefore you need to have a degree of economic evidence. And we're saying, well, there might need to be some on the margins. I understand that, but really what we're talking about is, in the words of Advocate General Cocotte, these are speeding offenses, these are drunk driving offenses, and so therefore we hope that the Parliament and the European Commission itself and the institutions can recognize that it is not warranted to put these kinds of cases into this mired, delayed appeal system at the European level. Ideally, if it could go straight to the ECJ, then great, rather than the General Court. But that kind of aspect is what we would encourage, appreciating that that itself is a big ask. I've been banging on for 20 years.
Huge ask.
For 20 years for dissents. Why can we not, after 60 years, feel that the acquis communautaire in Europe can handle dissents? And all the judges always come back and go, you can never possibly have a dissent at the European Court. I totally disagree with that. And so we can't even get dissents. So I appreciate changing the appeal system or adding a complementary, slightly speedier track to resolve these disputes is a big ask. But for me, we do these things because they're difficult, right? And so, when people come back at me and go, this is going to be impossible, it's never going to work. Great, let's find a workaround. Let's do something, because if we don't, something much worse is going to come. The greatest critics I've had have without the report and the previous one, Furman, don't recognize that if we just rely on ex post enforcement, the European auditors report today coming out again saying everything's too slow, that will just bolster the voices for much, much stronger regulation. And you might see some of the crazy stuff that's coming out of India with banning Walmart and Amazon from selling their own products on their own websites, which is just price raising to the middle class and protectionist of the entity called Reliance there. Very scary regulatory involvement. And final thing, these suggestions, just like the market investigations regime in the UK, as you know, they're like a pressure valve, so that political movement to just break everybody up or just draft crazy regulations that haven't been means tested or had any impact assessment, that pressure goes away. And so appreciating, we'll always have critics that we haven't done enough, but at the same time, I know we have critics who say this goes way too far. And I just hope that somehow we can come to some understanding that at the very least, when you've got a paper-based adjudication mechanism looking at blacklist practices, you do not need to send it into a system that takes 5 years to work out the appeal.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Philip. I mean, we are trying to be sort of tight to our timing. We try to make it not more than an hour. We are Latin American. As the Italians, we would love to discuss maybe for ages and hours. But honestly, it's lunchtime here. I think it's dinner time over there. So thank you very, very much again, Philip, Simonetta, and all the audience. This is an ongoing discussion. I think this will not be the last discussion of the IDC regarding these issues. Actually, next week, we're having maybe quite a very different view on these issues, because we're having Social Right and Alexander Cordeiro from CAGI will present their own view on the report on the Global Antitrust Institute published last week. So you're definitely all more than invited to continue the discussion and the discussion of ideas, as we said at the beginning. Nico, I don't know if you have anything to say, but before you take the floor again, Philip, it's always a pleasure to listen to your comments. Simonetta, it's great to have you on the IDC. And Philip, you promised that you would sing. I don't know if Nicolas could maybe convince you. Nicolas?
Yeah, actually, some people say that Philip might be Eminem, so I don't know if we can if you're going to sing today, Philip. But I just wanted to thank you and to thank everybody for staying with us today, and we look forward to see you again in other discussions.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to sing, but we are all prisoners of our own device. All I'll say, you can hum the rest of it. So let's make sure that we're not prisoners, but we're digital kings and queens.
Okay.